a new deep dive edition of Maker's Bar. We're going to cover a really interesting topic today: why products fail. Today, we'll go over some of the most common mistakes made while building a product and how to avoid them. I'm Gayathri Geetha, and for the last 15 years, I've had the pleasure of working with some killer teams to take several products from idea to launch across search, e-commerce, and B2B SaaS. So whether you're an entrepreneur launching your product or service or a product manager, I hope this session is valuable and you're walking away with some helpful insights. Let's begin. Now here's a stat you're likely familiar with. A whopping 9 out of 10 startups fail. 9 out of 10 startups. Let that sink in for a moment. While there could be several reasons here, there are 3 top culprits that show up time and time again. First, market. Listen, you may have the best team, the most well-executed product, but if the market is not big enough, if market conditions are not right or ready for your idea, you will not win. So before you start building your idea or your product, it's super important to ensure that the problem that you have in mind is worth solving for. Next up is product market fit. Now, what is product market fit? Simply put, it's a test of whether your product meets your market's needs. When you get this right, you will find that you're selling your product to your intended audience. Your audience is excited to use it. They're raving about it to other people. You're doing something right. Third, it's your go-to-market or GTM. This is a very, very important strategy to get right because you can have the best product that's solving the best customer needs. You can have amazing demand for this, but if you're not selling or distributing it on the right channels, the channels where your consumers are, and you're not converting these consumers in these channels, then you're not having the intended impact. So let's go ahead and dive into these 3 pillars in more detail. I'm going to start with the first pillar, market. Now, when you walk into an investor meeting to pitch your idea, investors want to know your TAM. So TAM stands for Total Addressable Market. Now, what they're really looking to find out is, okay, you have this idea, how big is this going to get? Is this a big enough problem to solve? And when estimating TAM, the first mistake people make is to go ahead and rely on some arbitrarily large industry-wide numbers. And then they just call it a day. So let's say, I'll take an example. Let's say you're really passionate about creating, healthy food or healthy snacks for pets. Now, you simply can't just say like, hey, the pet food market is a 97.5 billion market. I expect to capture 5% of it eventually. So my TAM is 4.8 billion. Now, that's not realistic. It gives you a very false idea of how big your idea is going to be. So what do you do, right? So the first learning here is don't inflate your TAM by including these type of irrelevant customer segments and avoid this type of vanity TAM, right? So you need to really dig deep into the right customer segment for your needs. So maybe in the pet food market, you're specifically first targeting customers who are interested in organic vegan products for their pets, for example. You guesstimate that and you start with that. Now, outside of figuring out if you have a large enough market, you have to dig deeper into the landscape, into the marketing landscape. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it has taught us that there will be trends happening in the market, right? So which is causing a shift happening in the market. Maybe the market is growing, maybe it's shrinking. That's super important to take into account as well. So let's say you have a large enough market. Let's say you feel like the trends are going in your favor. What do you do next? So the next step you should do is quantify what your TAM is. You quantify it in terms of how much people are willing to spend. So if this is an existing market, you need to figure out what are they currently spending. So the way to do this is you narrow it down to a category or a segment that you're going after, and you factor in how your product will differentiate and solve the pain points for users in that segment. So let's take an example, right? So when Uber, they pitched their service, they didn't come out and say, hey, we're working on something completely new. It's going to disrupt the way the transportation industry works. and we're creating a net new market for this. This is not what they came out and said, right? So they started off with an existing category. They said, hey, we are building Uber as a replacement for black car service. Now that's a known market, that's known spend. And they said the reason why we have a right to win in this space, the reason why we are differentiated, our technology can actually win in this space, is because instead of calling individual black car service providers, our app is going to streamline the process for the user. It's going to simplify how the users are going to get notified, how payment is made, and so on. That's the value they're bringing into the table. Now, on the flip side, just relying on existing markets is not a very good idea if you are indeed coming up with an idea which doesn't have any existing market spend, right? So, for example, maybe you're coming up with a new solution, you're creating a new category. What do you do when that happens? So let me take an example. When Fitbit was first introduced, Fitbit, as you folks know, is a fitness device that you can wear and track your steps, your workouts, and so on. When they launched, the wearable fitness device market was still in its infancy. If they had only looked at existing markets, they would have just missed an opportunity to launch Fitbit. So this is where, in these types of instances, you can do a couple of things. You can, one, make sure that you're analyzing the market and seeing if it's ripe for disruption. Are there any signals you're getting around the market that say that, hey, this is something that would be a good time to kind of launch this service? And then the second piece is you can actually use a more bottoms-up approach. I'll talk about the jobs to be done framework later as well. But this framework is super helpful to kind of go ahead and identify, what the pain points of your user are. And once you're actually going ahead and stating that, you're able to predict certain spend. So you can use the jobs to be done framework to elaborate what pain point you're solving. Then you go ahead and assign a best guesstimate of what someone would pay to have that problem solved, and then compute the spend that way. All right. So the next pillar I'm going to talk about is product market fit, also called PMF. So PMF, as we'll see in these different examples, it will take a while, okay? But when you are in it, you will know it. When your product hits PMF, you no longer have to put a lot of energy or face an uphill battle to sell your product in the market. Your audience will, quote, get it. They'll be excited to try this. They will rave about this to others. So today, what we're going to do is discuss certain principles you need to know on how to get your PMF right. Because the last thing you want to do is take months and months and months to build a product that doesn't take off as intended, and consumers aren't finding it useful. So I'm going to start off with the case study of Airbnb. I really love their story here. So Joe Gebbia and Brian Chesky, they are the founders of Airbnb. They were figuring out how to make their rent check for their apartments in SF. That's how this whole journey started. So Joe, he noticed that there's going to be this design conference happening in the city. And he figured, hey, if they are struggling to pay rent in this really expensive city, maybe there are other people who would be struggling to find reasonably priced accommodation in this expensive city. So let's go ahead, take out an ad in a prominent design magazine and just rent out an air mattress in their room, right? And that's the use case they had in mind, that they wanted to rent this extra space for people traveling for events. And, the kind of assumption they were trying to test out is, will a stranger, will you trust a stranger enough to kind of stay in such a place? Lo and behold, they actually had 3 people renting their space. And you can see that they've inadvertently vetted demand. They've seen that there is a market for this type of thing. Now, in any marketplace idea, you need to vet both supply and demand. So for their next step, they validated if hosts would rent their rooms out for events, and they allowed their users to go ahead and discover rooms around them. That worked too, right? And lastly, what they had to test for was repeat customers. So the stickiness of a product, I can't emphasize this enough, the stickiness or of the product is your true measure of PMF. If you have a customer coming back again and again to kind of use your product, that's a really, really good signal. So what they did is they added a number of value-added features. They had, for example, a photo service for a property where they would go and they would take photos of a property for free for the host. This way they were able to build a relationship with the host. They had a post to Craigslist option. So their listings could actually reach a much wider market and so on. And they continue to innovate in this space, right? So with these features, they became the trusted source for rentals. So this was their product market fit, and they had achieved product market fit. Now, what you can see from here is it wasn't an overnight process, right? It took them about 2 years to kind of get this right. And then you saw that they did not rest with this. They didn't simply just stop innovating after this. They experimented with expanding the same idea to adjacent markets, whether they're unique stays, experiences, adventures, and so on. And every step of the way, they did the same thing. They vetted supply, they vetted demand as soon as possible. So this is their story. And now let's actually talk about the principles to follow to achieve product market fit for your product. All right. This is the most fundamental but important thing to kind of take away. So whether you're building a product marketplace like Airbnb or you're building a SaaS product, get to the paying customer as soon as possible. And here's why, right? So say you're building out a SaaS product, you can do all the discovery calls you want, user surveys you want, and so on. But you shouldn't just stop with feedback. Because sometimes what happens is you might actually go to these customers, the customers might say, wow, this is such a cool idea. I think I would actually use this. But unless they're paying for it, they have no skin in the game, right? So while you're doing all this research, go ahead and try and build out a V1 pilot that you can either charge customers for or maybe give them a deal, get it in front of them so they will actually try it and they will help you hone your product and make it a much better product, right? And you get some actual data on usage and so on based off of that. So as you can see, this is what the folks at Airbnb did, right? They got to paying customers right away. And at every step of the way, that's what they did to vet supply and demand. The next piece to keep in mind is having an iterative mindset. Okay, so product market fit takes time, folks. Any successful company or product worth its salt will go through several iterations before becoming successful. And what's more, sometimes products even lose their product market fit based on different industry trends and they need to rebuild again. So what you need to do is, number one, have an iterative mindset. And second, always be on the lookout. Always be on the lookout for how you're differentiating. What is your right to win? So in the case of Airbnb's case, what was their right to win, right? So the main way somebody could actually rent a room prior to Airbnb coming on was via Craigslist. And so what Airbnb's approach provided was better visibility to these listings, a photo service to get pictures increased customer trust with that photo service, provide a much better experience to both the hosts as well as to the consumers. This is how they differentiated themselves. Last but not the least, one thing to kind of stay away from is over-engineering your MVP or your minimum viable product. As you can see from the Airbnb example, they didn't have all the bells and whistles. They didn't have advanced search, scheduling, payment, and so on. They just had a very simple website to begin with. And use that kind of a mentality to test your assumptions, to test your hypothesis, and track whatever learnings or progress you're making along the way somewhere, right? So I can't stress how important this mindset and this approach is. If you over-engineer, you're going to spend months building something nobody wants to use. And if you go too long without tracking, you forget what assumptions you made and you resort to a more recency bias, right? So you go with the most recent data, even though it was not the best solution or the best data. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, the last pillar we're going to cover is GTM or go-to-market. Now, the term go to market, it's used to describe the roadmap or strategy that shows how your product will get to customers. So, how will your customers learn about your product? How will your product be positioned across against its competitors? How will sales objections, if you have a number of competitors in the space, how will sales objections be overcome? How will customers pay for your product, and so on? So, all of this is encompassed in your go to market strategy. So this is almost as important, if not more important sometimes than product design, because once you start thinking about go to market design or strategy, it will definitely influence your product requirements and your product design itself. So key takeaway: you need to develop this really early, if not before your product development, maybe in parallel with your product development. Don't put this off. So the first mistake here, when you're thinking about go to market, is people just throw in too many different channels and they see what sticks. Like they just jump to execution right away. Oh, great! I need a go to market strategy. Maybe I'll try a social media campaign to get my product out. Maybe I'll try a Google Ads. Maybe I'll list it on a marketplace. I'll do email marketing. Maybe I'll try all of these, right? So they try too many different things. So the first principle is don't jump into execution right away and hope something sticks. Take the time, focus some time in developing your strategy. So how do you actually do this? How do you develop a really good go-to-market strategy? You think through who you're solving this problem for, right? So who are the initial customers, your first 100, first 1,000, your next milestone, whatever that is? Where is the next set of users going to come from? And for these users, what is your value proposition? Right. So the jobs to be done framework that I was referring to earlier, it's a great way to express this. If you haven't heard about this, the jobs to be done or the JTBD framework, what is this, right? So when people buy a product, they are buying a product with an expectation that this product will solve a certain problem for them. It's going to make their lives better in a meaningful way by helping them resolve a struggle, right? So when you're resolving that struggle, that's the job to be done. What struggle are you, or what pain point are you resolving for your end user? That's the job to be done. So in the case of Uber, right, Uber is not just about getting users from point A to point B. That's a very broad jobs to be done. It's getting them from A to B in a very stress-free manner, right? So they simplify the whole thing. They simplify how you select a vehicle, they simplify how you get notifications, they simplify how you pay for this, and so on. So stress is the struggle that they are solving for their customers. And this is a very, very powerful exercise. Your jobs to be done statements, it can really help you hone your positioning, your messaging, and so on when you speak to your teammates, when you speak to your sales teams. But what I would urge you is, once you have the customer in mind, once you have the value proposition in mind, don't just stop with that. Create an artifact. I'll share different artifact examples, but a press release is a really good example of an artifact you can create. So a press release, it was a concept that's popularized by Amazon, right? What it is the document which is just imagining what a product launch or a release announcement would say in the future. So if you launch this product, it'll capture things like, hey, what the product is, who is it for, what is the value proposition, that is, how will it make the customer's life better, why they should trust you, maybe even what customer quotes could look like. So this is a very, very powerful exercise, folks, because like I said, once you're actually done with this, this document is what you can take to maybe change your website copy, where you're talking to your customer about what your product is going to help them with. Maybe you can put it into a sales deck that you actually pass off to your sales teams when they have to go and sell this product to other folks. So this artifact, this kind of a press release type of an artifact, it's killer. I would definitely urge all of you to build this out for your product as well. So next up, let's talk channels. So channels are where your customers discover and engage with your product. So this channels is where all of your pipeline generation is coming from, right? And the main thing to remember here, like I said, there's just so many different types of channels you can go down on. But the main thing to remember is less is more, and consistency matters, right? So think about how do you pick the right channel? You think about where your customer profile lives, where do they spend their time, what are your competitors doing, and you narrow it down to, I would say, 1 to 2 channels at most. You don't need more than that. So will you list this in a marketplace? Will it be an add-on SKU? Will you share this on social media? What each channel you pick, every channel you pick will actually take some effort and time and understanding how to win there, right? So it's going to take some time. So focus on 1 or 2, and go ahead and develop your own playbook around the channel, right? So you've narrowed down your channel, you develop your playbook of sales and marketing activities based on your customer profile, then run this playbook consistently over and over again. Give it some time, just give it some time, and then tweak it as need be and be patient. And finally, when you think about go to market and channels, one mistake folks make is they just stop at pipeline generation. You can't just do that. You don't just stop at, oh, this is where all my leads are going to come in. I'm getting 100,000 people coming in through this post or whatever, right? So don't stop with that. You need to think through to conversion. Don't keep it as an afterthought. So for example, if you have a product-led strategy, how will you convert all of your freemium users, right? If you're using email marketing, what are the types of reminders and things you want to automate to actually convert them into leads? So think about conversion. And my final tip is leverage the power of customer stories to drive up conversion. People trust people, folks. That's that simple. Tell me the last time you bought something off of Amazon with 0 reviews. I can't remember the last time I did something like that. So you're selling a course, you go ahead, you collect testimonials. You're building a SaaS product, you have a reference customer story. Go with your pilot customer, any customer you get a reference customer story from that. If you have physical products that you're selling on Amazon, participate in programs like Wine to get those initial customer reviews. So that about wraps it up for today's presentation, where we covered some things to avoid and best practices, right, around ensuring that, one, your product is solving a big enough problem, that is, there's a market for it. 2, how to build a product that meets market's needs or product market fit. And lastly, how to have a solid go-to-market. So I hope some of these insights were helpful to you. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions around any of these topics or building product in general,